For the past couple of years or so, the European Commission has been investigating a number of big US tech companies suspected of not fully complying with the EU's new digital regulations. However, the Commission has been wary of imposing too many fines or being too combative in enforcing these new regulations, presumably to avoid drawing Trump's ire at a particularly delicate time for transatlantic relations. That was until last week, when the Commission suddenly announced a new antitrust probe into Meta and whacked a fine on Elon Musk's X, before then opening another probe into Alphabet on Tuesday. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at what's happened in the past couple of days, and try to figure out why the Commission has apparently changed its tone. Who is the most influential person in the world? Well, last year the TLDR audience ranked Donald Trump as number 1, with these people all landing in the top 10. But do you agree? Click the link in the description to cast your vote for our 2026 ranking. So let's start with a bit of context. This story all begins with the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, two landmark pieces of EU legislation that came into force in November 2022. This is a bit of a simplification, but the DSA is essentially about content moderation. It imposes obligations on online platforms to make sure the content that they host isn't illegal or inappropriate, to provide easy ways for users to flag such content, and to be more transparent about their algorithms and ads. Conversely, the Digital Markets Act is less about content moderation and more about preventing monopoly abuse. It thus applies exclusively to big tech companies known as gatekeepers, defined as any company with an annual turnover of at least €7.5 billion in the EU, or a market valuation of at least €75 billion, or at least 45 million monthly end users and at least 10,000 business users established in the EU. The DMA essentially tries to prevent these gatekeepers from abusing their dominant market position by requiring them to provide interoperability with third parties and banning them from using their own dominant position to promote their own products unfairly. Failing to comply with the DSA risks a maximum fine of up to 6% of a company's global annual turnover, with the possibility of the platform being banned in the EU in extreme cases, while failing to comply with the DMA risks a maximum fine of up to 10% of the company's total worldwide annual turnover, a figure that gets boosted to 20% in the event of repeated infringements. In the case of so-called systematic infringements, the EU will consider additional remedies, including, quote, behavioural and structural remedies, a euphemistic reference to a forced breakup. It's worth noting, however, that these fines aren't issued out of the blue. The EU will first open an investigation and warn the relevant tech company that they're not living up to their obligations, and then, if the tech company refuses to make changes, the EU can impose fines in response. In practice, both these pieces of legislation mainly affect big tech companies. Obviously, the DMA only applies to the so-called gatekeepers, but the DSA is also designed such that bigger companies face more stringent obligations to avoid overburdening smaller companies with tons of complicated regulations. Because most tech companies are American, think Alphabet, Meta and X, this means that these pieces of legislation mainly affect US companies. Unsurprisingly, the Trump administration doesn't like this, and see the DMA and DSA as essentially ways for the EU to extort American businesses. For their part, the EU argues that, if big US tech companies want to operate in the EU, they have to abide by the EU's regulations, and would probably note that the legislation isn't actually targeted at American companies specifically. It's just more focused on big companies, and big tech companies tend to be American. If anything, Europe's lack of big tech companies has been a long-standing frustration for the EU, and if they could have their own homegrown tech companies to tax and regulate, they would. Anyway, the first DMA-related fines were issued in April of this year, when Apple was hit with a €500 million fine for allegedly abusing its monopoly position by forcing app developers to use the App Store's payment options, and Meta was hit with a €200 million fine for forcing users to pay to avoid data collection. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the Trump administration, which accused the EU of, quote, economic extortion, and threatened to launch a retaliatory trade investigation into the EU. This then led to further negotiations between Meta and Apple and the EU, but despite no final settlement, no further fines were issued. The European Commission would never say this out loud, but this does seem to be at least partly a political decision. The Commission avoided issuing further fines because they wanted to keep Trump on side during trade deal negotiations and Ukraine negotiations. However, in the past week or so, we've seen a sudden flurry of activity from European regulators. On Thursday, the Commission launched a new antitrust investigation into Meta to determine whether it was abusing its monopoly position by preventing rival AI groups from offering their services on WhatsApp. Although it's worth noting that this new investigation falls under traditional antitrust laws rather than the DMA. Then, on Friday, the Commission announced it would be levying a €120 million fine on Elon Musk's X for failing to meet its transparency obligations, the first fine ever issued under the DSA. Specifically, the European Commission argues that X's blue tick system is deceptive because blue tick users aren't meaningfully verified, that X's ad repository isn't sufficiently transparent, and that X has failed to provide researchers with access to the platform's public data. Finally, on Tuesday, the EU opened yet another antitrust investigation into Alphabet to determine whether Google used web publishers' content to provide generative AI services on its search results page without appropriate compensation and without giving them the option to refuse. So, why this sudden flurry of regulatory activity against the big US tech companies? Well, again, while the Commission would never say this out loud, there's clearly a political angle to this. The Commission has come under pressure from senior European politicians to be more muscular in enforcing the DMA and DSA. After all, there were a whole load of outstanding negotiations with big tech companies, like Apple and Meta, that don't really seem to be going anywhere. French President Emmanuel Macron, for instance, last month accused the Commission of being too slow in enforcing its new tech rules, while the co-chair of the Greens in the European Parliament told Politico last week that the Commission should, quote, just implement the law, which means they need to be tougher. There's also a sense in Europe that bending the knee to Trump doesn't actually achieve very much. After all, the EU has done pretty much everything Trump's asked of it. But this hasn't been enough to transform him into either an enthusiastic supporter of Ukraine or the transatlantic relationship more generally. Finally, it's worth noting this fits into a wider international trend of governments across the world taking more of an interest in digital regulation. Most obviously, Australia has recently implemented a social media ban for under-16s, but Malaysia, Denmark and Norway are all considering similar bans. Our magazine Too Long is now officially in stock, with this latest issue focusing on the reshaping of the Middle East. In it, we run through each country in the region to discuss how they're rewriting the next chapter of their story. From Qatar's growing global influence, who will govern New Gaza if Iran could dash for a nuke, or how Lebanon can disarm Hezbollah. This is a region we know a lot of you are interested in. So this latest issue dives deep with our real thoughts on the next era of this often troubled region. Not only that, we also have sections focusing on UK, EU and global news, including our full rundown of some of the biggest elections which happened around the world over the last year. There's also our interview with YouTube's Money and Macro on how to fix the EU economy, the rise of the politician influencer and the new left emerging in the UK. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special Christmas offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use code December25 at checkout.